Most people think democracies end with a coup d'etat or, tanks in the street or somebody shooting up the presidential palace. But actually, in the modern world, they mostly end because someone who is legitimately elected begins to take apart the system and take away the things that ensure free elections can continue. And I started watching that happen in multiple countries at the same time. And I saw this authoritarian instinct start to come back. And that's what I write about now.
Are these just election cycles? Or is there something bigger at play here? Because, I spend a lot of time reading articles from decades ago or hundreds of years ago. And in all times in history, it seems that there were problems. But it seems that the democratic system has a remarkable way every 4 years of clearing out what people weren't happy with and putting something new in. Is this time different to the past?
What feels different to me is for the first time in several established democracies, most notably the United States, but not only, you have political parties who come to power with the explicit idea that they will alter the system in order to make sure that they can stay in forever. The pioneer of this idea was Viktor Orban in Hungary. He was elected legitimately with a big margin, and then what he did was slowly seek to capture the state. So what a democracy needs in order to survive, in order to maintain its stability, it needs a few neutral institutions. It needs independent courts. It needs an independent electoral commission. It needs independent media. In the modern world, it needs a meritocratic bureaucracy. So people are hired and fired to measure pollution or worry about traffic and road construction who aren't cousins of the ruling party. They aren't somebody's friend, but they're actual experts who understand how to do things. So you need those things to be in place in order to ensure that each time there's an electoral cycle, it's a fair election. And you see people who are elected who once they had power, decided to take those institutions apart. If you think about democracy, it's actually a very strange system, right? So you win an election, and in a democracy, you have to preserve the rules so that 4 years from now, your bitter enemies can contest you and maybe beat you again. You lose an election, you have to say, okay, we're allowing our rivals to stay in power, but we trust that the system will remain fair. So 4 years from now, we can also contest them again. So it requires a certain level of agreement about the nature of the system. And when that begins to break down, then you begin to have imbalances, and then you begin to have elections that seem unfair to people, and then you begin to have a completely different kind of national conversation. And we can see that has happened in several places, and of course, most notably in the United States. And because the United States is the largest democracy, because it's played the role of leader of the democratic world, the influence of America on other countries is pretty profound. And so this idea that democracies can possibly break down is suddenly both horrifying people, but also interesting to other people who say, all right, if you can do it in America, you can do it here.
There's a part of me that just thinks that could never happen in America. And that's obviously a bias that I have being 33 years old and not knowing a ton about history. But I'm sure there's lots of people that think this is some sort of theoretical idea, but it would never happen in America because we would never allow America to not be a democracy. We wouldn't allow a Russia situation where you've got Putin sitting in power for 2 decades or whatever.
Sure, but there are systems in between Russia and liberal democracy. You can have democracies that aren't fair. And actually, I'm afraid to tell you that in the United States, there is a history of that. So in the American South, before the civil rights movement, you very often had, in effect, in the southern states, you had these one-party states where the rules were pretty rigged. Everybody knew who was going to win. Not everybody was allowed to vote. So black people weren't allowed to vote, or it was very heavily restricted. It was hard for them to vote. And that existed in the United States, between the Civil War and the 1960s. You had very undemocratic parts of the United States. And I think some of the people who are in Washington right now in the Trump administration are working from that history and from that historical memory.
What is your biggest concern in this regard?
Well, I have two concerns. One is that inside the United States, the deterioration of American democracy I mean, it's already happening, right? So it's already creating a class of people who no longer feel they have a stake in the political system and who won't vote, may never vote, and will be outside of politics and outside of the national conversation. That can lead in the direction of violence, that can lead in all kinds of negative directions. We see the development of new kinds of paramilitary in the United States that we never had before, the development of ICE. We've never before had a single national police force wearing combat uniforms, wearing masks, not subject to the normal restrictions of local police forces. We also have a rise in high-end corruption. The president, people around him, companies close to him seem to have access to ways to make money and are making money out of doing politics in a way that was also not possible at that scale in America before. And that's sort of one whole set of concerns if you want to go down one of those roads.
There's this map in front of us on the table. I realize some people can't see because they're listening, but there's a map on the table in front of us. Could you just explain what this map shows and why it's significant?
The map shows the level of democracy around the world. And of course, the thing that's immediately notable to me is that those who made the map don't count the United States anymore as a liberal democracy. So a liberal democracy meaning a state where, as I said, the electoral rules are clear, where the electoral system is set up not to favor one party or the next. And instead, it's described as an electoral democracy, which is somewhat less free. You see similar systems in South America. In Europe, you mostly still have liberal democracies. In Australia, Japan, South Korea, you still have liberal democracies. And then most of the rest of the world are some form of autocracy, either very closed and very repressive like China or like Russia, or they are in a democratic gray zone. So there are states that could really go in either direction. I mean, they're still open. But it's true that if you'd looked at a map like this a decade ago or 2 decades ago, it would have been a lot bluer, the blue being democracy and the red or reddish being autocracy. So you do see an absolute process of democratic decline that's been written about by many people over the last few years. I believe very much that states influence one another. People follow and imitate and copy their neighbors.
Do you think it's possible that in our lifetimes, the US might become an autocratic country?
So the US could become what I think on this map is described as an autocratic gray zone. So you could imagine the US as in effect a one-party state. So a state where one political party has control and the other just can't win national elections. You already have this system of, we call it gerrymandering, where electoral districts are being written in such a way as to favor one party or another. The effect of that also is that once you have people who don't really have to contest elections anymore, then you have corruption. Because if you're going to win anyway, why do you have to worry about your constituents? Then you have worse government and worse services, because if you don't have to have an electoral contest, then you can pursue your own interests. You can do favors for businessmen who help you in other ways. And we see this decline of democracy already at the state level. And of course, there could be a danger at the national level of a fixed system that made sure only one party ever wins. And then you would get all these pathologies that we already have at the state level, and we're beginning to have them even now. And remember, we have right now a president who refused to accept the result of an election in 2020 and who staged what was intended to be an electoral coup. It failed, but the idea that he wouldn't do it again or nobody would ever dare to do that or nobody would block an election, I think it's pretty naive at this point. I mean, it happened.